April 18, 1942, the sea was black and endless, rolling under a ceiling of low clouds. Spray lashed across the steel deck of the carrier USS Hornet, its bow rising and falling through the cold morning mist. The ship groaned as it fought the waves, 40,000 tons of American determination heading straight for enemy waters. On her deck, lined up in tight formation, were 16 olive drab bombers. Army bombers, on a Navy ship. A sight no sailor had ever seen before. Engines coughed, sputtered, then roared to life one by one. Men in leather flight helmets leaned out of their hatches, goggles fogged, eyes narrowed against the salt wind. The flight deck trembled beneath them. Ahead, the sea stretched toward Japan, still more than 600 miles away. There would be no turning back. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, a compact, confident man with a calm face and a mind built for risk, climbed into his B-25. He glanced at the horizon and then at his crew. "Let's go," he said softly. At 8:20 a.m., the first bomber lurched forward. The wind howled over the bow. Sailors stood frozen, watching as the wheels lifted just feet before the deck ended. The plane dipped, vanished behind a wave, and then rose again, wobbling into the gray sky. Behind it, 15 more followed. One by one, they disappeared east, into the storm and toward history. No one knew if they'd return. No one expected they would. But what they carried with them that morning wasn't just bombs. It was the first spark of American retaliation, a message to Japan that the fight had only begun. December 7, 1941. The day the Pacific exploded. Just 4 months before the Doolittle Raid, the United States had been dealt the most devastating military blow in its history. On that Sunday morning, Japanese carrier planes swept across Pearl Harbor like a steel storm, sinking battleships, killing over 2,000 Americans, and igniting a global fire. The attack stunned the nation. In Washington, the news spread like wildfire. Across the country, people gathered around radios, faces pale, fists clenched. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's voice came through the static the next day, calling it a date which will live in infamy. America was now at war. But war in those first weeks felt one-sided. Japan's empire was unstoppable. Within days, their forces seized Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines. By early 1942, their armies controlled Hong Kong, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Their navy dominated the Pacific from the shores of California to the jungles of Burma. Every headline was grim. Every map bled red. Morale in the United States sank to the floor. Even the military's top brass struggled to imagine how to strike back. The Pacific Fleet was crippled, most of its battleships lying on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The Army Air Forces had few bases within range of Japan. It seemed impossible to reach the enemy's homeland. And yet, amid that darkness, one question kept echoing in Washington: how do we hit back? The answer would come from a man who had made a career out of doing the impossible. James Harold Doolittle was no ordinary pilot. He was already a legend long before the war, one of America's most daring airmen, a scientist, and an engineer with a doctorate from MIT. He had broken speed records, pioneered instrument flying, and raced across continents. He understood aircraft not just as machines, but as extensions of human courage. After Pearl Harbor, Doolittle was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to help plan America's air response. He saw what others didn't, that morale was as much a weapon as bombs or bullets. The nation needed proof that Japan wasn't untouchable, that the enemy who had attacked could also be struck in return. The problem was distance. Japan lay nearly 5,000 miles from the nearest American base. The bombers of the time couldn't fly that far, and the U.S. had no foothold close enough to launch a raid. It seemed physically impossible. But impossibility was something Doolittle had built his life around defying. In early January 1942, as Japanese forces advanced deeper into the Pacific, an idea began circulating in the highest levels of American command. Could medium bombers take off from an aircraft carrier, strike Japan, and then continue west to land in China? No one had ever tried it before. The Navy's carriers were designed for smaller, lighter planes, fighters and dive bombers. A twin-engine Army B-25 Mitchell weighed nearly 15 tons fully loaded. Launching one from a short carrier deck seemed suicidal. But Doolittle believed it could be done. He began running quiet tests with the Navy's help. At Eglin Field in Florida, Crews practiced takeoffs on short runways marked to match the Hornet's deck length, 467 feet. Pilots learned to push engines to full throttle while holding the brakes, then release in a single violent surge, lifting off at the very edge of disaster. Slowly, it started to seem possible. The B-25 was modified, extra fuel tanks replaced defensive guns, weight was stripped wherever possible. The crews knew they wouldn't have the protection of carrier fighters or enough gas to return. After bombing Japan, they would have to fly on to China or crash at sea. It was a one-way mission. Still, volunteers lined up. 80 men, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, raised their hands without hesitation. Most were in their early 20s. They didn't know the details of where they were going, only that the mission was dangerous and important. In March 1942, the training was complete. The 16 selected bombers were loaded onto the USS Hornet at Alameda Naval Air Station in California. Each was tied down to the deck, wings overlapping, their tails nearly touching the ship's island tower. The operation was so secret that even most of the Hornet's crew had no idea where they were headed. The next day, the task force set sail into the Pacific. The journey across the Pacific was a study in silence and suspense. On April 2, 1942, the Hornet departed San Francisco Bay, its decks crowded with strange aircraft and crews in unfamiliar uniforms. Alongside it sailed Task Force 16, under Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, commanding the USS Enterprise and its escorting cruisers and destroyers. The twin carrier groups were among the few powerful assets America still had in the Pacific. Their mission was simple in theory but perilous in reality: get close enough to Japan for Doolittle's bombers to launch. The plan was to approach within about 400 nautical miles of the Japanese coast, launch the raid, and then turn back before being detected. The bombers, once airborne, would fly on to China and, if lucky, land on friendly airfields. Every mile, every hour of the journey carried risk. Japanese submarines prowled the Pacific, and carrier patrols scoured the waters east of Japan. If discovered early, the mission would be doomed. For days, the ocean was a gray desert. The task force maintained radio silence, zigzagging through rough seas. The men slept little. On deck, the Army crews checked their planes, tested engines, and secured fuel lines. The air smelled of oil, salt, and fear. They were hundreds of miles from land, yet every man aboard knew that once the bombers took off, there would be no coming back. Inside his cramped quarters, Doolittle studied weather charts and fuel calculations late into the night. His confidence never wavered, at least not publicly. He had built the raid on mathematics and faith in his crews, faith in American ingenuity, and faith that the enemy's arrogance would leave them unprepared. On the morning of April 18, 1942, everything changed. At 7:38 a.m., a Japanese patrol vessel, the Nidomaru, spotted the American task force. The alarm was sounded, and though the ship was quickly sunk by gunfire, the warning had likely been transmitted to shore. They were still more than 650 miles from Japan, 200 miles farther out than planned. Doolittle and Halsey faced an impossible decision: launch now, far beyond safe range, or risk the entire fleet being discovered. Doolittle didn't hesitate. Launch the bombers. One by one, the 16 B-25s were rolled into position. The wind whipped across the deck, waves breaking over the bow. Crews tightened their harnesses, engines screaming at full power. Then, with a jolt, the first plane hurtled forward into the gray sky. The raid was on. What happened next would not only shock Japan but change the entire psychology of the Pacific War. And as the last bomber lifted off the Hornet, vanishing into the mist, the Japanese homeland had no idea that, for the first time in centuries, foreign bombers were on their way to strike its heart. The moment those bombers left the Hornet's deck, the Pacific seemed to hold its breath. Behind them, the fleet turned away, back toward safety. Ahead lay nothing but sky, ocean, and a nation that had never known invasion. For the 80 men aboard those 16 planes, there was no illusion about what awaited. Each crewman knew their odds of survival were slim. Their route offered no landing fields, no carrier to return to, no second chances. Still, not one man turned back. Inside the lead plane, Doolittle sat quietly in the left seat, the Pacific rolling beneath him like a dark, endless field. Navigator Henry Potter spread out maps across his lap, recalculating headings every few minutes. The engines droned steadily, burning fuel faster than expected. They all knew, if they missed the coast of China, there would be nothing but water. Each crew had its own rhythm. Some joked on the intercom, pretending to be calm. Others sat in silence, staring ahead through the haze. The sun climbed higher, the waves shimmering below. After hours of steady flight, the first shadow of land began to appear through breaks in the clouds. Japan. From the beginning, the Doolittle Raid had been a triumph of improvisation. Everything about it was against the rules of conventional warfare. Launching medium bombers from a carrier? Unheard of. Flying without fighter escort? Insane. Navigating hundreds of miles over the open ocean in uncertain weather? Near impossible. But the entire mission rested on a principle that often defines the turning points of war: the courage to try what the enemy believes you won't. For Japan, the Pacific War had been fought on its own terms. Its navy controlled the seas. Its air force ruled the skies. Its leadership, from Admiral Yamamoto down to the soldiers occupying Singapore, believed that America lacked both the will and ability to strike back swiftly. The Doolittle Raid would rip that illusion apart. Every plane carried 4 500-pound bombs. Their targets were industrial sites, military facilities, and oil depots in Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, symbolic more than strategic. The damage wouldn't cripple Japan's war industry, but the psychological blow would echo across the empire. On the American side, the raid was equally psychological. It wasn't about destruction, it was about proof. Proof that the U.S. could project power halfway across the world. Proof that Japanese soil was not sacred. Proof that after Pearl Harbor, America would not cower. The crews, young and mostly untested in combat, carried that knowledge with them. Many were barely in their 20s. Some wrote final letters before takeoff, leaving them behind on the Hornet, knowing they might never see home again. One crew member scrawled in his diary, "We are on our way to bomb Japan. This may be the last entry I ever write." It wasn't blind bravery, it was quiet, calculated defiance. The kind that defines nations in moments of greatest danger. Tokyo had grown complacent. For decades, Japanese citizens had been told their empire was unassailable, protected by the vast Pacific and by divine favor. Even as Japan expanded into China and Southeast Asia, its homeland had never been touched by enemy bombs. The idea of foreign aircraft over Tokyo was unthinkable. That morning, the skies over Japan were calm, the air filled with the sounds of a normal day: bicycles clattering, merchants shouting, schoolchildren laughing. Then came the distant hum. At first, few noticed. Some looked up, confused by the silhouettes of twin-engine planes moving low across the clouds. The Japanese had never seen aircraft like these. They assumed they were friendly. Minutes later, the bombs fell. Explosions tore through Tokyo's industrial districts, sending smoke spiraling above the city. Windows shattered, streets erupted in chaos. The first shock was disbelief. No one could comprehend that enemy planes had reached Japan. The air raid sirens wailed too late. Fire crews scrambled, soldiers rushed through the streets, civilians fled. And even as Japanese searchlights swept the night sky, looking for enemies who were already gone, the message of the Doolittle Raid had been burned into history. Rain swept across the hills of eastern China. In the darkness, American airmen stumbled through fields and villages, bruised, soaked, and disoriented. Some had landed safely. Others were injured, scattered across hundreds of miles of enemy-held territory. Their radios were gone, their fuel spent, their mission complete, but their survival uncertain. Colonel Doolittle woke at dawn in a rice field. His parachute lay tangled in the mud. Nearby, Chinese peasants approached cautiously. When they realized who he was, one of the Americans who had bombed Japan, they risked their lives to help. All across China, villagers did the same. They fed, clothed, and sheltered the downed crews, hiding them from Japanese patrols. The Chinese resistance and missionaries guided the men through mountain passes, across rivers, and toward safety. Of the 16 bombers launched, 15 reached China's airspace. 11 crews bailed out successfully. One landed in Vladivostok in the Soviet Union, where they were interned. The Soviets, still bound by a neutrality pact with Japan, quietly held them for over a year before releasing them. 3 crews were captured by Japanese forces. For those men, the nightmare was only beginning. In Japanese-occupied territory, capture meant torture and death. The Japanese military saw the raiders not as soldiers but as criminals, cowards who attacked civilians. The captured men were paraded through villages, interrogated brutally, and subjected to starvation and beatings. In October 1942, after months of imprisonment, 8 of the captured airmen were put on trial in Shanghai. The proceedings were a farce. They were accused of indiscriminate bombing and violating the rules of war, a bitter irony from a nation that had bombed Chinese cities relentlessly for years. 3 of the Americans, Lieutenants Dean Hallmark, William Farrow, and Corporal Harold Spatz, were executed by firing squad. The others were sentenced to life imprisonment. Their courage in captivity became one of the raid's most tragic yet enduring legacies. Meanwhile, Japan's retaliation on China was swift and merciless. Furious at the Chinese for aiding the American airmen, the Japanese army launched a campaign of retribution across the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi, the regions where most of the crews had landed. The offensive began in May 1942 and lasted for months. Entire towns were wiped out. Villages suspected of helping the Americans were burned to the ground. Tens of thousands of civilians were executed. Biological weapons, plague, anthrax, cholera, were tested on prisoners and released into the countryside. By the time the campaign ended, an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians were dead. The Doolittle Raid had shaken Japan's pride, but it had also unleashed one of the cruelest reprisals of the Pacific War. Doolittle himself, upon learning of the executions and massacres years later, was devastated. "We never intended for such suffering," he said. But war doesn't ask for intentions. It demands consequences. Yet amid all the loss, the raid's strategic and psychological success could not be denied. When Doolittle and his surviving crews finally reached Chongqing, the wartime capital of China, they were greeted as heroes. Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Chinese nationalist government, personally thanked them for their bravery. The men were exhausted, malnourished, and still unsure if their mission had even mattered. But back in Washington, the news of their success had already electrified a nation. When word reached the United States that American bombers had struck Tokyo, the effect was instantaneous. Newspapers across the country blared the headlines, "U.S. bombers raid Tokyo." Japan's homeland hit for first time. For a nation reeling from Pearl Harbor, it was the first burst of hope in months. The public didn't know the details, or the immense risks, but they didn't need to. All they needed to hear was that America had struck back. Crowds gathered in cities, waving flags and cheering. In factories, workers stopped to listen to radio reports. In Washington, President Roosevelt met with reporters and, when asked where the bombers had launched from, smiled and replied, "Shangri-La." It was a clever diversion, a mythical name from a popular novel, meant to hide the operation's true origins. But it also captured the spirit of the raid, something bold, impossible, and almost magical. Roosevelt understood what Doolittle had achieved. The actual damage to Japan's war industry was small, a few factories, oil depots, and power plants hit. But psychologically, it was immense. The Japanese military had been embarrassed. The American people had been revived. Doolittle, who had expected court-martial for losing all 16 planes, instead received the Medal of Honor. When Roosevelt placed it around his neck, he said quietly, "You've done more than you'll ever know." The Doolittle Raid became a symbol, proof that America's industrial might, courage, and imagination could reach anywhere. It wasn't just a bombing mission, it was a declaration. Within the U.S. military, it also sparked a crucial shift in strategy. The Army and Navy began to see how long-range air power and carrier operations could combine, a lesson that would define the coming battles of the Pacific. More importantly, it planted the seed of offensive momentum. Before the raid, the Allies had been on the defensive everywhere. After it, the idea of striking back no longer felt impossible. Plans were already underway for the next great test, one that would decide control of the Pacific. That test would come at Midway. In Tokyo, the mood was the opposite of celebration. The Doolittle Raid had wounded Japan's pride in a way no previous defeat had. When the news reached Emperor Hirohito, he was reportedly shocked. For the first time, the war had reached his capital. The Army and Navy immediately blamed each other. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and architect of Pearl Harbor, took personal responsibility. He knew that the Americans could not have launched such a raid without carriers operating dangerously close to Japan. That realization cut deep. Japan's supposed shield of the Pacific had been penetrated. Yamamoto resolved to eliminate the U.S. carriers once and for all. His plan was audacious: to lure the remaining American fleet into a trap near a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific called Midway. There, the Imperial Navy would crush them in one decisive battle, restoring Japan's dominance. But Yamamoto's decision, born of anger and humiliation, would instead lead to disaster. In June 1942, less than 2 months after the Doolittle Raid, the Japanese fleet sailed toward Midway. They believed the Americans were still weak, disorganized, and on the defensive. They were wrong. Using intercepted codes and intelligence, the U.S. Navy anticipated Yamamoto's plan. When the Japanese carriers arrived, American dive bombers struck first. In a few hours, 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Saryu, and Hiryu, were destroyed. The same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were now burning in the Pacific. It was one of the most decisive battles in naval history, a turning point from which Japan would never recover. And in a sense, it began with the Doolittle Raid. Yamamoto's desire for revenge after the humiliation of April 18 had pushed him into a fight he could not win. The raid had not only shaken Japan's confidence, it had also altered its strategy, and in doing so, changed the fate of the entire war. For the 80 men who flew it, the Doolittle Raid would define their lives. Of those 80, 73 survived the war. Their courage became legend. Many continued to serve throughout the Pacific Campaign, some in new bomber units that would later devastate Japan's cities from the Marianas. In China, the memory of their mission remained sacred. Chinese families who had helped them were honored for generations, though many had paid for their bravery with their lives. For James Doolittle, the raid was both a triumph and a burden. In later years, he spoke rarely of it. When he did, his words carried both pride and humility. "I could never adequately express my gratitude," he said, "to the men who flew with me, and to those who never came home." History often remembers wars by their great battles, the sweeping victories, the grand strategies, the famous names. But sometimes, the moment that changes everything isn't a battle at all. Sometimes it's an act of defiance. The Doolittle Raid was one such moment. It didn't destroy Japan's war machine. It didn't win territory. It didn't even return home safely. But it shifted something far greater: the human psychology of the Pacific War. For the Japanese people, it was a rude awakening, proof that their empire was not invincible, that the war they had unleashed could reach their own cities. For the Japanese military, it was a lesson in underestimation, that an enemy driven by desperation could still innovate, adapt, and strike where least expected. For the Americans, it was a rebirth of spirit. The shock of Pearl Harbor had turned into a fire of resolve. The Doolittle Raid told every factory worker, every pilot in training, every soldier on the front lines that the United States was still in the fight, and just getting started. In a broader sense, it showed what courage can mean when the odds seem impossible. 16 bombers. 80 men. No base, no backup, no guarantee of survival. Yet they flew, because someone had to. Because a nation needed to believe again. War is often measured in victories and losses, but sometimes its true power lies in a single act that restores faith, not in weapons, but in will. As Doolittle later reflected, the mission was not about bombs. It was about sending a message, to the Japanese, to the world, and to ourselves. That message echoed across the Pacific, across time, and across generations. That the fire lit over Tokyo in April 1942 was not the fire of destruction, but the spark of a comeback. And for Japan, it was the first unmistakable sign of what the next 3 years would prove beyond doubt, that America's war had only just begun.